Welcome to this episode of The Good, the Bad and the Odd Kingology. I think we're on number 7 now, and with, sorry, my mistake, number 8, The Dead Zone by Stephen King, obviously. And I'm going to talk about the book, the movie, and a little on the TV series, though I've only watched one of those. Right, okay, so The Dead Zone was first published in 1979. The story is about Johnny Smith, who has a accident involving his head, maybe his brain, when he was a little boy, which he doesn't remember, and then he subsequently has this kind of feeling sometimes, but he then gets injured in a fairly significant car accident after this weird bout where he can somehow predict the numbers coming up on a sort of a wheel of fortune, and makes a lot of money on it. But on the way home he has an accident. He has the best night of his life with this girl, Sarah, and he has an accident on the way home. She's taken sick because she eats a bad hot dog. He gets a cab on the way home and has a massive car accident with joyriders and ends up in a coma for 5 years. While this happens, everything's moved on. So when he wakes up, she's married with a kid, but he's got these psychic powers. He can touch people and sort of see into their future or know about them. Sort of bits about their past as well. It's an intriguing story. In parallel to this, we get a little story about this door-to-door kind of salesman called Greg Stilson, who's got either mental problems, certainly emotional problems, but he might be psychopathic. I start with him kicking a dog to death that annoys him, that rips his pants even though he's cruel to it. Johnny was a high school teacher and Sarah was too, and basically the story is a little more, I don't know, it's not quite the more direct narrative that King usually serves up. When he has a fractured narrative, it's usually because it's through several different character arcs and things like that. But in this one, it's the same character, but it's kind of a fractured book. I find it, and for me, that means it's a little less engaging. It is a great piece of writing, but I do think of the ones we've talked about so far, this is probably the weakest story. Though having said that, the ending's fine in it. It culminates to a proper sense, where now King is often criticised for poor endings, but this one, it works well. There's effectively 3 or 4 different parts. The first part really is the setup, so I wouldn't consider that a part. It's like Act 1. It's him coming out of the coma and finding out the sort of limits of his power. Then there's 3 sort of semi-fractured sub-stories after that. He helps find using his powers the Castle Rock Killer, which is an interesting story. Then it's about him teaching this boy who's got problems with his comprehension skills and reading skills, but in that he uses psychic powers to foresee the sort of prom is going to end in disaster, and he kind of encourages it to be called off. It doesn't entirely get called off, but a large number of the class go somewhere else, and so it's kind of, he saves a lot, but a lot die too, and that kind of affects him quite badly. And then finally, Greg Stilson rises a political power, and he, by accident, shakes his hand. He gets sort of caught at a rally and foresees that Greg Stilson may become president one day, and that would lead to sort of World War III. Now these 3 different stories, I think, lead to a fractured narrative and a loss of momentum, and it doesn't quite it isn't quite the page turner of the others, because when you're in one story and go to another, it kind of throws you off a little. I would have liked to have seen more Greg Stilson, actually, although there was a fair amount, but I would have liked to have. I did read one book, a kind of cool book I got recently about the films of Stephen King by Anne. Can't remember her name. The films of Stephen King, it's called, and she makes the point that this film is the film is about the true seer versus the true prophet versus the false prophet, which I think is a good way of putting it. Greg Stilson is definitely a false prophet. He's promising hope in this, but he's bringing disaster. Whereas Johnny, who's kind of vilified, is a true prophet. And while I say it's the weakest of all the ones so far, it's still pretty damn good. It's just the other works, The Stand and The Long Walk and Carrie and all of the ones I've reviewed so far, I feel are much more solid pieces of work, coherent pieces of work. There's lots that I liked about it. The Wheel of Fortune scene in particular has a real drive about it, a real. You just got to keep reading and reading. And the King's got some interesting touches throughout. There's one bit that made me laugh. There's a woman screaming about Johnny's like the character for Carrie, for example. That kind of made me laugh. And there's also a bit that made me laugh where John goes to buy the rifle that he wants to kill Greg Stilson with, and he gives his name as John Smith, and the guy selling it to him kind of smiles inside because he thinks that obviously it's an alias, John Smith. I like this whole dialogue about if you could go back and kill Hitler, would you? Which I think fascinated King. He actually explored in some detail the diametric opposite of this. What happens if you could stop Kennedy getting shot? Would you? In his more recent work, 12263, which I've read and I quite enjoyed. But it's kind of interesting. This kind of death. Changing in history, how does that affect future events? Kind of fascinates King, I think. It's a solid and fine read, but it's basically is overshadowed by the previous books. I would definitely recommend it. I'd say it's a great book. It's a great book, but it's just not as good as the others I've read, in my opinion. Now, some people hold this as one of his best works, so it's really a question of taste, perhaps. Let's go on to the film. The film was made only 4 years after the novel was published, and it already went for a number of changes in just that short 4 years. Different production companies had rights and felt if the companies collapsed and stuff like that. And Cronenberg was signed up in the initial stages of dropped, or it fell apart, was the deals fell apart, but he somehow got re-added to it. Now this is interesting. This is one of the first works Cronenberg did where it wasn't his own stories. He was sort of adapting someone else's, and there were a few different attempts at adaptation, but in the end Cronenberg and I think a co-writer locked themselves away to try and hammer something into shape. Now it's quite a good adaptation of the book. I think Christopher Walken's quite a good Johnny Smith, even though he's a bit odd to be the everyman. He's got something about him, hasn't he, Christopher Walken? Though I think he does quite a good job. And there's something about this film that's got a certain coldness for it. Well, when he's looking for the Castle Rock killer in the snow, there's a lot of snow and it gives it a cold feel, a kind of freezing feel that's a sort of allegory of the frozen time that Johnny spent. And they cut quite a few corners, for example. He doesn't have massive amounts of therapy, of work done to help him walk again. It's kind of, he can walk a bit already when he wakes up after 5 years. And lots of elements get chopped. That we get very little backstory on Stilson, for example. Now, his decision about what to do about Stilson, which is quite prolonged in the book, is cut short. And the whole Wheel of Fortune scene, which I think could have been included and was kind of fun, was cut too. However, I did like some of the contractions. I like the Doctor played by Herbert Lom. His whole backstory was covered a little, but he kind of substituted in for other characters and dialogues that Johnny had. He was the one, for example, talk about killing Hitler, which kind of makes sense in the way the film's got it. And it does feel like you're really blasted. It's a very, very fast narrative, and you're blasting through the main points of the book really quickly. It almost feels like it could have been, to add 20 minutes more and just been a good film too, but I appreciate Cronenberg wanted to deliver the story, and it goes at a really fast pace. He covers uncovering the Castle Rock killer, the teaching of the boy and warning him off, but it isn't a problem this time, it's something else, and then also trying to do something about Stilson, and we kind of see what Stilson actually does here in this one. What if he becomes president, what will happen? There's a scene showing it, which is probably about as little as you need and still work, and the whole Stilson thing still work. A little more backstory would have been nice around Stilson, but I kind of get it. I kind of like the film though. I thought it was a solid film, a good entry in the Stephen King canon, I'd say. Rather enjoyable. I gave the film 7 out of 10. Which brings us to the TV series. Now, I think there's like 5 or 6 seasons of this TV series, and so it's obviously it's got something about it. And I watched a pilot just to get a feel. And the guy playing Johnny, who was, let me just check, Anthony Michael Hall, was actually pretty good. They'd obviously, watching the first one, they'd obviously fractured the narrative up into a complete, Stilson was in it, for example, or is in it, becomes in it, and it was kind of, there was other characters too. It was come from a much more affluent family. His mother, there was a preacher in it who kind of, I think, I don't know, because I haven't watched the whole, I've only read a little about what else happened. There seems like they've got some various character arcs, but essentially it's still like a man with psychic powers, and I can kind of see how this is going. Now, watching the first one, there was all sorts of new stuff as well as old, all cut up in a different way, and you can kind of see it really suffered from being a 90s TV drama. It had 90s TV drama dripping all over it. It was a bit corny in places. Some of the writing was a bit soap opera-y, but it was okay as a pilot. What I really did like about it is how they used his visions in the first one. They'd obviously had a lot of thought about this, and they did some really interesting things. For example, they made these visions of what was happening or people's lives while they were still having a conversation with him. So while Sarah, for example, was straightening her husband's tie in a vision, she was still talking to Johnny about how he is and stuff like that. So the vision merged into his current reality, kind of nice way. And there was another vision where it stopped time, and he could walk through stopped time and look around, which I thought was a really nice touch. I can see that really working well. You can tell there's going to be some really long story arcs in this, and it's going to, obviously, I don't know enough to be sure, but I think it's obvious from watching the pilot, Johnny's going to help solve crimes, and Johnny's going to help people. Well, helping people is the more significant one, because he helps the doctor that helps him in the first one. And I found the way he helped him quite touching. The scene around the resolution of the doctor and his mother was kind of touching. And even though we really didn't have much of the doctor in it kind of worked. So I can see why people would like this show. It had mixing drama and sort of sci-fi in this sort of psychic way would be quite appealing. I thought, I might go back to it and watch more, but for now, no, I'm going to park it. There's so many other TV shows I want to watch, but I like the feel of it. Apart from the 90s TV drama-itis, it was kind of suffering from it. It ached badly from that, and it might be improved. It wasn't. I'm trying to think of a similar show which I've thrown, but really from the 90s, some of the early seasons of Star Trek suffered from the same kind of feel. X-Files was always fairly solid, I thought, so that's not a good example. But it's that era, isn't it? Sort of X-Files, early 90s. I rather liked it. I thought it was decent enough, and I might come back to it. I'd be interested if anyone's got any feedback about the TV series, any comments, email or MP3 comments about the TV series. I'd like to hear a bit more. So next time I'm reading Firestarter. So I'm going to read the book, which I've read before, and watch the movie, which I've read before. I'm not going to bother with any sequels. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 sequels, but I'm not going to bother with those. It'll just be the book and the movie. Okay, so that's it from Mark with this episode of Kingology. Bye from me.